Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And okay, now I think I'm close to being properly back on schedule. A little bit exasperating because I think I could have gotten a few solo reviews out of albums I'm covering here. I just need to be better at making those when they're actually appropriate. That's on me. In other words, it's likely going to be long and a fair bit more complicated than usual, so let's get on the pulse. So before we go any further, if you would like to like and subscribe, I'm extremely grateful for it. Still trying to grow the channel, it's a work in progress. But now onto the matter at hand. We got 6 projects on the docket. Let's go back and talk about from Fox's The Kick. Well, this is some quick turnaround time. But alright, jokes aside, this is the independent, full-length album that Fox's has been promising, and one I did genuinely want to cover after her shorter project from last year, and unfortunately, what I was deeply worried about from that last album has surfaced on The Kick. And I'm inclined to be charitable to Fox's here. She's got a great voice, she's now independent, she's trying to fit within the modern pop ecosystem, but unfortunately she's going to play for the tighter, more processed new disco sound that, as I said before, doesn't take advantage of her penchant for bombast. She's just not as tight or dominant of a presence to make this work like a Dua Lipa or a Carly Rae Jepsen, even if overall the bass lines and grooves are pretty damn effective. And when you factor in some iffy vocal production that seems to hem in a lot of her power, not helped by a burbling, synth-heavy mix that can feel a little bit claustrophobic and over-processed, especially with the percussion, which often feels a lot clunkier than it should. Hell, all the instruments sound kind of synthetic, and that does not exactly help some already so-so hooks really pop off, which is why the saxophone on Gentleman, and especially Bodysuit, stands out so much in a great way, but that's the point, there should be more of that. Unfortunately, the other thing that doesn't stand out is the writing. Clearly looking for a release of a lot of tension, be it on the dance floor, a distant relationship, or a more sensual release as she pulls more self-confidence to bear. But let's be real, it's nothing all that distinctive or super well constructed, and that's been a problem with Fox's work since the very beginning. I mean, it's not bad for what it is, sadly just kind of derivative and forgettable. And even when I thought her work was a little bit shallow before, I went back to that more, a lot more likely than I'll return to this. Just saying. Next up, the self-titled album from Zeal Ardor. I give you smoke and fire. The last time I covered Zeal Ardor, I got a lot of backlash, and I get why. Regardless of the murky place from whence this act sprang, my problems ultimately translated more into the execution in compositions and production, and yet it's kind of hard to get away from that assumed lineage. Now, since then, I've actually seen them live at Sonic Temple back in 2019. Once again, I got the impression they may not be exploring the messy complexities of their sonic approach, but if it translates live, a lot of folks won't care, and now years removed from all of that, I did want to give them a proper chance. And I'm comfortable saying that I'm going to get significantly less worked up about this band going forward with this self-titled album. Because while I don't think it's all that good, the stakes feel a lot lower this time. And the place to really highlight a lot of that is the writing, where the roots of the old spirituals are way more defined on the first projects. A lot of the lyrics here, they circle around some pretty bargain barrel Satanism and nihilistic anti-religious sentiments, with a few passing jabs at American myopia and industry, but let's be real, nothing that feels all that substantive or remotely challenging. And I kind of wonder why, because while Stranger Fruit had its fair share of ideas that felt like dead ends, this album feels like it's all over the goddamn place, spanning from their usual bluesy stomp juxtaposed with black metal screams and shredding, to a lot of chugging riffs and breakdowns that wouldn't sound out of place among, metalcore or deathcore, complete with the undercooked bass lines and the triggered drum kits that you might expect to match. And then it even gets to the more synth-inflected passages, where the band might claim more of an industrial influence, but it feels way closer to modern, pop-inflected alternative rock, with a lot of loud, squonking synths synths and programmed percussion. It is kind of the sort of mess that I would argue only works in pieces, if at all. Maybe with a couple singles targeted for commercial rock radio crossover. I mean, it's the only way you could explain some of these choices beyond just mischief and experimentation in the studio. And you know, that might be fair, that could be a thing as well. But thus, I'm left wishing that overall more of this worked or felt more interesting beyond just being pastiches of other sounds that are not being done all that well. And minus a lot of instrumental texture or interesting production dynamics, frontman Manuel Gagnon produces and plays the majority of instruments on this project minus the drums, and you can kind of tell in how clean it all feels. But I just wish there was a little bit more to this in terms of the compositions that really stuck. Hell, more often than not, I found myself gravitating to the songs that were closest enough to Zeal Ardor's original sound, like Golden Lyre and Church Burns. But even then, we're not talking about that much. Hit or miss at best. Can't really recommend it. Next up from Big Thief, Dragon, New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You.
City shine, crying out, take me to the limits of your love.
Okay, full disclosure, my exasperation with this band and this album is going to make this review sound way more negative than it is. Cause on some level, this is not Big Thief's fault. If they had stayed a middling indie folk band languishing on Bandcamp or picking up a small cult following from Brooklyn, I wouldn't have cause to care. Not about Adrienne Lenker's vocals that have never clicked for me, nor the shambling compositions that I find terminally underwhelming and occasionally questionably produced, nor the writing that I have never found to be all that impactful or interesting or beautiful like so many have. But since they got signed to 4AD and they got a marketing budget and suddenly the critical acclaim is falling from the ivory towers, and yet I'm looking at the indie folk and the country scene that will never get this level of attention despite having stronger hooks and sharper writing, and yet how many will truly go looking for these acts? You don't have to answer. I've seen exactly how much traffic my indie country reviews draw. I know what happens here. So, when Big Thief drops an 80-minute genre-sprawling project and the critical acclaim comes pouring in, and I've once again heard so many acts touch on these sounds and do them better, especially whenever Big Thief dabbles with country, which has the feel of Brooklynite hipsters playing the genre for a goof, and it's as tacky as it always is. It's just so immensely frustrating, especially when I don't think this is all that great. Some of the issues have carried over and punctured any sense of beauty or texture. I still don't particularly like Adrienne Lenker's voice. I said it when I reviewed Songs in a retro review back in 2021. I've never felt any sort of distinctive charisma or presence, and even if she's more lively on this album, it leans into a twee side that rarely if ever works for me. But they've also got some other issues that are more pronounced this time, like the production and mixing sounding uncharacteristically rough to go along with the shaggy, often sloppy sounding compositions and guitar pickups that still never sound as warm as they really should. That's what happens when you record in multiple studios with different engineers who have wildly varying sounds. But of course, that's the point. This is an album that's sprawling and playful. They clearly had a lot of fun assembling this in the studios, which is why they leave in the studio chatter and why the sequencing has no rhyme or reason, mashing whatever elements they could think of together with this growing sense of whimsy and humor in order to balance out the more melancholic songs, or that just god-awful attempt at blues on Love, Love, Love. But I also have two replies to that. Number one, this approach works best, if at all, when there's a strong enough core of character or charisma to buy in, and I don't think that's there, and the occasional hook wouldn't hurt here either, and that doesn't materialize for me. Or you get the impression that it's building to something bigger, that there's enough strong shards to be more than the sum of their parts. I mean, it would still be bloated as all hell, but it'd be kind of redeemable. And alright, again, there are good songs here. I'm left wondering more than a few times why Big Thief got away from some of their weirder compositional experiments, as it leaves chunks of this album feeling not all that far removed from a brand of clattering indie folk that I said with Anais Mitchell was getting played out a decade ago. But you know what? Sometimes the good songs still shine through, with the ethereal wells of strumming on the title track or No Reason, especially with that flute, or the electric guitar sparking off the clattering little things. You can definitely hear Sean Everett Pirate's influence really blazing through. And even if I think songs like Spud Infinity are impressively stupid and really test my patience, the fiddle there on Red Moon and Dried Roses, it does sound pretty great. And while the lyrics definitely lean way harder than they should on homespun, twee, slice of life material, and without good sequencing, a fair few songs just wind up feeling kind of redundant, when Adrienne Lenker does lean into bigger, more abstract language to trace beginnings and ends and encompassing both the highs and the low oscillations of life and love, you know what, I'll be honest, I did find some pathos, even if thematically I could rattle off a bunch of albums that hit very similar thematic territory with even similar genre and construction, most notably Father John Misty's pure comedy. But I'll end it here. For me, this is decent. It's rarely bad, but it's bloated as all hell, in my opinion, wildly overrated. But regardless of how you feel about this album, if you like the flourishes into country specifically, please go back to my year-end list, take your pick of the names. There's a lot of great acts that'll likely wind up being on your alley and will have nowhere close to the marketing budget or attention or critical acclaim that this will get. I think they're personally way better than this, but I'll leave that up for you to decide. Next up from Frank Turner, FTHC. The thing about a world-shaping events like a pandemic, especially ones that leave you isolated, forced to look inward, that more often than not you will unearth the roots, the incidental details or trauma that might have had a longer and deeper impact on you than you'll want to admit. And how you'll react to that can be extremely revealing, and when Frank Turner did it, he made one of his most raw, explosively punk, and deeply personal albums since the 2000s. Now, as much as I've thought Frank Turner has had his standouts on every project the past decade, even on Tape Deck Heart, there were guardrails. And in recent years, it has left some projects feeling kind of compromised, or lacking that added layer of complexity or introspection. Not this time! And that means we're gonna have to start by tackling the elephant in the room right away, because there are more than a few songs here that feel like a direct response to the criticisms that his last two albums got. Specifically from those who thought the social commentary didn't quite work all the way through. At best, his response is passive-aggressive, but still kind of insightful in ways that'll often go overlooked in the better responses to getting canceled rhetoric. I mean, you can't expect purity out of individuals. Nobody is perfect in this working amidst bad systems. He did actually have good intentions, which for the record I believe, even as someone who was very critical of those albums. And social media can be a hellhole full of disingenuous call-out nonsense. You know this. But on the other hand, it can absolutely read as a self-flagellating, defensive bad look that even knowing Frank Turner is more liberal than leftist, it can leave you feeling that songs like Perfect Score and Non Serviam and My Bad, they don't come across well. And I'm not here to argue that, because not only does that make sense, they also kind of work in an uncomfortable way, at least for me. Maybe it's having been on the wrong side of a social media hate mob that on some level was complete bullshit, of which Turner's been on a couple of times going back the past decade, but I completely get the emotional impulse to go to this place when confronted with people behind online shields of black-pilled irony who would rather target someone as the villain of the day rather than put some actual fucking skin in the game and fight the real systemic rot, or at least more relevant enemies. And as much as nobody wants to hear allies grapple with privilege in their art, especially in punk, hell, I've called that out myself, within the larger meltdown context of this album, with Frank Turner confronting isolation, anxiety, and some deeply buried childhood issues, including the clumsy confrontation with his absentee and now trans father on Fatherless and Miranda, I mean, it becomes understandable if you're not confronting him at his best. Hell, none of us are at our best. That's the point. Granted, that was also probably true for the last couple albums, even if he was putting on a happy face, but now it's just spraying into the ocean, only enhanced by the overblown production from bringing back Rick Costey that can be almost oppressively loud, compressed, raw, and messy, especially when more synthetic tones will come in. And while that can leave me frustrated with how the hell they mic'd that drum kit from song to song, I also can't deny this has the most intensity, momentum, and genuine genuine rage Frank Turner has brought in years, and when it's nailed alongside some of his strongest hooks, is this exactly the sort of folk punk that clicks so hard for me. From the bangers of Haven't Been Doing So Well, Fatherless, The Resurrectionist, Punches, to the heartfelt tearjerker A Wave Across the Bay, and the spoken word country-esque reckoning with history on the closing Farewell to My City. So look, it's not Love Iron Song or England Keep My Bones, probably the album that exposes Frank Turner at his most human, for better and absolutely for worst, but I think this is fucking great. It hit where it needed for me. Probably won't for you, but still worth a proper chance. Next up from Spoon, Lucifer on the Sofa.
Call to me. I was lost. I've been kept on my knees.
Oh yeah, this is the kind of album that On the Pulse was made for. Generally solid, completely worth talking about because this is a band that's got a pedigree for decades, but also not worth spending a ton of words discussing at length because come on, it's Spoon. They're one of the most ridiculously consistent and likable bands in indie rock. You know exactly what they do and have done since the 90s. So, now 5 years removed from Hot Thoughts, a smarter album that's aged a lot better than you might think. What variations on the formula does Spoon have this time? Well, a lot of folks are calling this a return to form, or at least to the thicker snarl that characterized their early 2000s work, with Dave Fridman only producing the closing title track and thankfully avoiding a lot of his worst compressed tendencies. Now, part of this is probably tied to Mark Rankin coming in as a producer for the majority of this album. He's more known for his engineering credits, but I can definitely tell some of that chunky heft that he brought to Queens of the Stone Age showed up in a couple of songs here, like The Hardest Cut with that nasty guitar line, or that shambling groove and choppy acoustics on Wild. But I also gotta say, this album has the most scuzz and blues rock tone that this band has had in decades, to say nothing of how the piano work will translate to cuts like On the Radio, or the sax that will come through on that title track. And that gives the project a very different swagger, and one I kind of like. And you know, I like a lot of the content as well. There's a greater sense of emotional honesty that's really been creeping into Spoon's writing the past couple of albums, and when you actually pair it with those blues rock bravado, it allows a little bit more textured vulnerability to slip into the picture, especially in the face of so many larger forces that are beyond his control. A lot of men wind up damned if they don't realize that, and then they will lose the battle to their darker natures. And yeah, that's kind of it. I'm not saying this album is bad by any means. Again, it's really good. I certainly think the production is better and the writing is solid, but I'll also say it's not an album where the hooks grab me consistently in comparison with their earlier albums, or even They Want My Soul or Hot Thoughts. That is kind of the double-edged sword that's coming back to very familiar territory for a band like Spoon. Certainly agreeable, solid, their diehard fans will love it, but if you heard some of the innovations on their last couple albums, and you kind of wish they would have incorporated more of those ideas into their sound or composition, you might be left a little bit cold, especially if, like me, you've been a little less interested in this style of blues rock for a while. It's getting kind of played out. Still really damn good, will probably be great for those who have a lot of nostalgia for early Spoon. Absolutely worth hearing. Check it out. And finally, from Beach House, Once, Twice, Melody.
Fell across the sky.
And speaking of bands who really fit well into a format like this, well, the tricky thing with talking about Beach House albums, that variations in their overall approach and vibe, they are subtle enough that it can be tough to contextualize in a review, and they really need to be placed in the context of their larger catalog. That being said, I was a little bit concerned about this project, comprised of 4 parts, comfortably running over an hour, and that could be a lengthy run for a dream pop project, even if the waves of critical acclaim was placing this among their best with Teen Dream and Bloom. And to me, well, when it comes to Beach House, it's just a lot of everything, showing their most facets all at once while still making a lot of what you would expect. You will definitely tell it's a Beach House album. But as someone who has a very specific flavor of beach house that I like more than others, and given how sprawling and weirdly sequenced this project is, I'm a lot more lukewarm on this album than I would like to be. Now, part of it is my general preference for the melodic warmth and swell that comes with more organic guitars, softer wells of synth, Victoria Legrand's slower register, and some live drums, and you absolutely get those moments, but they're juxtaposed with as many songs where the fizzy drum machines are right at the very front of the mix, the higher register vocals are swallowed in reverb, and the very cyclical melodic progressions and crescendos, they feel chilly and a little distant, not especially helped by when they go for more shoegaze and don't quite bring the grooves that were the greatest highlights of Seven. And while some of those synth choices can work for me, given the analog callbacks to the earliest dream pop of the 1980s, Masquerade in particular has a really cool gothic trip-hop vibe with a darker flair that I think kinda worked. It's also not consistent. So you'll get the oily mess of Pink Funeral and Through Me, where the elegant attempts at melody with the strings get tangled, or how Illusion of Forever just drowns itself in reverb, or the overprocessed Runaway and Finale, or that weirdly insistent percussion on the back half of Over and Over and All Over Hurts to Love. And again, this is where a lack of coherent sequencing really hurts this. I'd say it feels like 4 EPs mashed together, but the larger truth is that none of these individual moments have a coherent style in between them. So it's harder for the vibe to stick, and you wind up with pieces more than a solid whole, like the percussive romance of Superstar, or that subtle pulsating thrum beneath the organ swell on Another Go-Round, or that gorgeous strings embellishment on ESP, or really just how great the acoustic guitars are integrated opposite the choral vocals on Sunset, or the incredible warmth of the bells. There are great songs here. And I'll also say it doesn't really help that for as much as I like the romantic language and framing of a lot of these songs, a lot of unrequited yearning, relationships that fall short but for understandable reasons, a whole lot of language around stillness and time and infinity, more to paint the sweeping drama of the romance, and I'd say it works. It's also hard not to feel like it doesn't have the same thematic depth or complexity as Seven did, and there's definitely songs that can feel kind of redundant, especially all the more evident when this album sprawls out the way it does. But look, I think there's enough songs here to have a streamlined and pretty great beach house album, but it's bogged down with plenty that just does not rise to match it. It definitely caught some vibes, but in comparison with Teen Dream, Bloom, or Seven, not among my favorites. Still worth hearing, but just not great, at least for me. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Again, I had to say a lot with this one. It went long, apologies. But hey, comments are down there. I guarantee I said something controversial. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to argue with me more directly, or potentially get albums onto my schedule going forward, which hopefully I'll be able to manage a little bit more effectively, or hell, just support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but if you want to, options available. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On The Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.